Okay, welcome everybody. A few just coming in, a few people just coming in. Well, welcome back after half term. This meeting of the Bedford Schools Forum. Have we had any questions? Alison?
We haven't been notified of any questions, Chair.
Okay, thank you. And we have had a couple of apologies who are Duncan Gold and Stuart Locke. Are there any other apologies? Okay. Minutes of the meeting held last month have been circulated. Are there any errors that anybody has noticed in them? So I'll sign those in due course. Are there any disclosures of interest from members of the forum? Yep. So now we go on to item 5 on the agenda, the membership of the forum. And there are various changes. There was recruitment of new members and some volunteers to come forward. We have to approve their co-option. Laura Tigney to be the PVI representative. Any objections?
I'll take these bits back.
Okay. Then that is approved. Nick Hackett as the Maintained Schools primary head teacher. Any comments? Otherwise, I would take that as approved. Alison Wiltshaw and Helen Anderson as Academy representatives. And Richard Cook as a Maintained primary school governor. Good. So I'll take those all as approved. And then we also have to note the resignations of Sarah Leavesley and Stuart Locke. Okay. So now we go on to the item 6 on the agenda, update on schools budget for 25-26 and 26-27. Is it Rhiannon?
Yes, thank you, Chair. So the report shows the position in relation to the current year of the dedicated schools grant and includes the latest DSG settlement received in November 2025, along with the forecast spend for the 4 blocks as at December. Appendix A of the report also shows the movement across each of the blocks in the funding. So schools blocks is showing to have a small underspend within the current year, which is related to the growth fund. The block also has a balance brought forward into the financial year, of which it is intended to utilise around £500,000 to help support with the deficit on the high needs block. Within the early years block, the forecast has been revised to reflect the summer and autumn term actuals with estimates for the spring term. The current hours are above those budgeted and therefore the contingency is being utilised to support this cost. But this is, however, offset by the underspend in the SEN costs, which have arisen due to the change in the process of funding the SEN within this block. Any underspend in this block will roll forward into future years. The Central Services block, or CSSB, is forecasting to be on budget. There was also a balance brought forward from the reserve, which is intended to transfer again to help with the high needs block. So the high needs block budgeted for a deficit in the current year of 2.8 million. However, there is a forecast underspend within the block of 1.3 million due to growth in the top-ups not being quite as high as we anticipated, and a review of some high-cost placements. So although there is a forecast underspend, it's still leading to a growth in the deficit of around 1.5 million. The deficit brought forward, the transfers in the current year and the current monitoring position means that we're currently forecasting a high needs deficit of 2.286 million at the end of March. Chris will give further updates on the high needs moving forward in his presentation later on the agenda. Thank you very much, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Are there any questions or comments on that report?
Yeah, I have.
Yeah, okay, Deirdre.
Basically, is it the case that for the DSG, the high needs block and the early years block, allocations have been reduced because the number of children and young people in the education system in Bedford must have fallen? And if this is the case, then what is the fall in numbers of children and young people? And I think we need some sort of table or chart to sort of show the analysis of that, because is it the birth rates? And obviously the birth rates would affect the early years provision. And I know that it was mentioned at the last meeting that there was a fall in numbers in terms of kids going into schools. But I do think that we need some clarity around what that actually means in facts. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
I'll defer to Chris on that around the numbers of children within the system.
Yeah, thank you. So Bedford Borough has had a 7% decline in birth rate compared to 14% nationally. So yes, that is true. However, we are still a net migrator in. So in terms of actually the total number of pupils that we have in our schools is circa about 5,000 more than we had 10 years ago. So, and January to January census, we had a slight pause in our January to January census numbers growing in the 24 to 25. That was the first time it hasn't grown. On average, it's growing by about 500 to 600 more children in the system every single year. So no is the answer to your first part of the question. Is as a result of the the funding going down, pupil numbers, we're not seeing that. We actually have more pupils in the system than we have done before. So we are growing as a borough. We have a 5-year forecast. So in terms of you asked for that data, that's been circulated around all governors and all head teachers. I can circulate that to you, Deirdre. That gets the breakdown of the numbers in terms of that. And also we have GP registration data. So again, that's available as part of our forecasting, but again, it's available if we're talking about earlier settings and they're interested in their ward birth rate data, they can ask. We can circulate that as part of our sufficiency planning as well. We know the numbers of children who are in each ward, but we get that data from our NHS colleagues both at 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 registrations, the numbers of children who are registered with GPs. Not that it's exact because we have some cross borders, but it's a good way of giving us some identification. So I can
just to supplement. So therefore, the allocations in the DSG high needs in the early years have been reduced not because of pupil numbers. Yeah.
What allocations are you referring to, Deirdre?
Just indicate the allocations in all of those blocks. Maybe it'll become clearer when we get into the high needs budget. Yeah. Okay, I'll leave. I'll put a question in clarity at the end of the meeting. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Deirdre. Are there any other questions? Okay. In which case we are invited to note the confirmation of the DSG for 25-26 received on 24th of November, and the current level of schools budget as at 31st December, subject to further in-year changes for schools transferring to academy status, and also to note the outcome of the disapplication requests submitted to the DfE relating to the 26-27 schools budget as detailed in paragraphs 521 to 522. Are you happy to take note? Those in favour? Any against? Okay, thank you. We've taken note of that. Now we come on to item 7 on the agenda, which will be Chris setting the scene for the high needs budget 26-27 and the overall deficit recovery plan. Chris.
Thank you, Chair. Always keen to set a scene. So if I share my slides, hopefully this will work. If I do that. That work, colleagues? Okay.
No.
No?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
All right. Yeah.
You kept me on my toes there, Chair. Thank you. Okay, so this is a presentation that's going to talk through the high needs budget, current position, and what has gone into the budget build. In preparation, so you'll remember at the last Schools Forum, we didn't present a paper on the 26-27 budget build because we wanted more time. I think when we got the high needs budget announcement, there was one school day left in term where we could have done some consultation before publishing a paper before the last Schools Forum. So we didn't. We deferred it to today to give us time to properly look at the allocation and also to discuss the presentation that I'm going to put before you. So it's already gone through Secondary Head Teachers Forum as well as also the Bedford Borough Learning Exchange, so Bubble, for head teachers. So I've presented this and had opportunities for questions as well and comments beforehand. So apologies those of you that are going to hear it again. It's very slightly different, but pretty much the same. So we're going to talk through this. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So the context, budget build, and the recovery plan, as well as questions. And I'm sure there may be some questions linked to both today's announcement and also the government's announcements around high needs deficits that came circa about 2 weeks ago as well, which I will address either now or also in the next paper as well. So the context. So we start off with in terms of I'm really conscious this is it's a public forum. There's also I'm really conscious of just in the nature of SEND, the nature of announcements both today and what was coming through in the white paper, that when we talk about budget positions and deficits, then we can have a tendency for people to be anxiety driven in terms of and people to be quite concerned about the situation. So I want to start off with some strengths around where we have in Bedford Borough. So again, in terms of we've talked about some of our strengths in our mainstream inclusion, some of our top ups, some of the support for children to be supported to maintain in their education and receive their education in mainstream settings. You'll see in number B, about 46% of all our AHCPs are in mainstream settings at the moment, and you see in number A, the top-up funding that is provided to our mainstream schools to support with that. Our ECNAF timeliness, so that's an acronym which is filled with the SEND world. So that's our Education, Health and Care Needs Assessments. So the numbers of that are completed in the statutory 20-week timescales. In fact, actually, our timeliness, we ended in 2025 in 96%. If we exclude exceptions, and 93% if we include exceptions in that. And again, our tribunal rates. So again, you'll have heard and you'll hear repeatedly about what can be quite a system that can lead to tribunal litigation and people feeling like they have to go to court to seek the support. Actually, our rate is less than a third of the national rate and less than a quarter of the statistical neighbours rate. And again, that also compares favourably in the eastern region. So actually, as a system, and where our support is, yes, as Rhiannon said, in terms of we're in deficit and our funding is, but I also think we've got a lot to be proud of in terms of in our support for children and young people who ascend across the whole of Bedford Borough. So our drivers for growth, so what's led to our drivers in our high cost spend. So we have our growth in our requests. So in terms of, you'll see that number in terms of just there's massive growth in numbers of children and young people who were receiving paperwork to request to assess. The growth in the total numbers of EHCPs, the complexity of need. It's a word there that's quite loaded. I know some parent carers will talk to me about, they don't like talking about their children being complex or not, but actually the complexity of needs in terms of the complexity of the provision that's required to meet their needs, if we talk in that way. And you'll see some of that. So again, the top 20% of all of our education, health and care plans account for 53% of our non-overhead spend in that. So again, where the system is in terms of towards the top end of where the funding is going. And we talked about there some of the growth in needs I'm going to talk about a little bit more. So what does this look like in terms of graph and pictorial form? So you will see again, this is our request for assessments. The drive green is the referrals from schools. You'll see that is still by far the highest rate of referral that receivers from schools and settings. Then we see the numbers of parental requests that we're getting is the second highest now, which is interesting and something that we're looking into and diving into to try and better understand what's leading to that. Our mediation and tribunals, our early years referrals, and all the others that are in there. But you'll see overall, the request for assessment as shown by the next slide is going up and up and up and up. And you'll see the numbers of average numbers of requests we're getting per month is also going up. You see that broken down as to particular areas. And this is really interesting for us when we're talking about our conversations with our Sencos and where they are. So in terms of, you'll see start of the year, understandably not getting too many in August, but the start of the year it sort of picks up to a peak. But also this is often also the peak where we're also having annual reviews coming in as well. So you'll see really high pressure, high stress times as well for the system, especially in our Sencos who are trying to support and coordinate that, which having this data is really useful to lead to those conversations. When we talk about our numbers of plans that we've issued, actually in 2025, we issued for the first time since 2018, it was the first time we issued less plans than we had done the year before. So although the numbers of requests were going up, actually numbers of plans issued actually sort of went down. And again, there's an interesting conversation for us about that gap in between what was driving some of that growth, a lot of that parental request actually, and trying to better understand and why that is and what is forcing some parts of the system to feel they require an EHCP where actually their needs could well be met at SEND support level, and trying to really work on trying to keep that that conversation going. So growth in cases is the biggest cost driver, and what's really interesting there, if you see our spend in 2020-21, just to pick an area, so 58% of our total spend was going on, if you see top-ups in purple there, and actually our forecast spend about 59% again is in top-ups. You'll see the grey area, which is some of our commissions, some of our internal services, was 23%, now down to 13%. The big growth here we see is our independent and AP. So whereas 12% of our expenditure in 2020 to 2021 was going on that, 20% of our expenditure is going on that. So bear that in mind when we talk about our high needs deficit recovery plan, this is a growth area. And if we could try and bring this down, we could try to recover some of our high spiraling costs that we have in those areas. So just to pick, again, we've picked just two areas, so some of our highest areas of need being autism and also SEMH. So if we look at autism in particular here, you'll see it's the highest area that we have. 40% of all of our EHCPs have autism now as the primary need. Massive growth area since 2020. Side note, it's really interesting that we're looking at this in our SEND improvement board, is the growth in autism as a primary for SEND support has not kept up. So it is definitely a growth in our EHCPs, and there's an interesting conversation there around our SEND support. But if we look at actually the top 20%, so here and here, account for 51% of the total spend, and you'll see that for some areas where we have the highest level of spend is in this cohort here. So it's trying to look at actually what's driving some of that, and some of that is high cost independent SEN placements where we haven't been able to support those children in the local areas, or we've had tribunals directing us to send children to other areas as well. And it's a very similar conversation here in social, emotional, mental health as well. The top 20% of those EHCPs account for 60% of the group as a whole. So the actual average spend, some of these young people down here, not massive, but when we get to the top end, and this is also one of the reasons you'll have seen why we don't have an SEMH special school in Bedford Borough, and therefore for those children who require SEMH specialist, we are having to go to independent APs, independent special schools or AP settings outside of the borough, which is a high cost area. So you see, again, what we're talking about there is independent special schools being 8.8 times the mainstream baseline. On that, no real difference between mainstream baseline and mainstream academy, but then you see some of the costs in some of the areas. And what this is actually, if we can support young people to have their needs met in mainstream, if we have their needs met in resource provisions, their needs met in special schools, state-funded special schools, that is a really good way of managing to keep the support as local. It's better for children and young people if we keep the local as well for families, but also where we haven't been able to do that, you can see that's where we've lost control of some of our expenditure as well. So this sort of builds on this. Again, Chair, you made a good point around, in terms of we didn't have no % of EHCPs, but this is just from a baseline of this position, we've had 92% growth in EHCPs over those 6 years. If you look at the spend in that time, 77% increase in spend. And then if you see, rates of EHCPs against the rate of spend, but more importantly, this is our allocation. So we have 64% increase in our allocation over that last 6-year period, but our 77% growth in our expenditure in that same time. So again, you will see this is the first time we fell into deficit in terms of but we were able to mitigate most of that with elements of DSG reserves that we weren't so able to do that sort of last year, and you'll see the gap is starting to widen there on our expenditure against what our allocation is, and that's sort of building this picture into where we are, and this is another way of showing that is a growing gap of funding. So to see this in terms of, again, this is without mitigations. This is where we're looking at the expected allocations, recognizing we can now cut off 28, 29 because the government announced they're going to take all SEND funding in-house, whatever that means. But even without that, we can see that the gap was widening without mitigations. Where we have put in mitigations, you'll see this is where we forecast our deficit. This is where we're actually forecasting it to be. So we are reducing, and we anticipate to continue to reduce our expenditure if we can achieve everything within our deficit recovery plan, with the hope being that we can get back to a net position, especially if the government does continue to provide funding support for those areas with their deficit recovery. So you'll see, as Rianne said, we're still not at the end of the financial year, so we are forecasting a 1.5 million deficit on that. That's down from where we were forecasting, and we're hoping to still continue to drive that down. But in our budget build, and I'll talk about our budget build in a second, we are looking at a budget which will set a £4.5 million deficit in year in that budget. We've had to use our key assumptions here. We could build a budget without any element of growth, but that would not be realistic, as shown by the graphs that we had. Again, not only just in the numbers of EHCPs, but the numbers of children who require high packages, high cost packages of support, either be it in local school systems or within the independent sector, and the cost per pupil going up. So you'll see at the bottom, and I'll talk about how we got to this point, but we've budget built to increase on every layer of top up by 3%. This is our budget. So this is what we were given. And again, what you will see is in terms of there's fixed costs. So I tried describing this when I was standing up and I was using my hands a lot. So I'm going to try and do it with a mouse. So bear with me on this one. Our proposed budget allocations, £42.273 million. That is where it is. Now, that is an increase on the allocation that we got this time last year, but actually what's realistic is look at, in year we've had different budgets and built, and actually if you look at it compared to the December point of view, that's the most realistic way of comparing it to like for like once we've had the import export and everything else that happens in year to see where we are. Now the fixed cost is obviously place funding for our high needs specialist places. So our increase in our specialist places, be it in our academy special schools. So, the increase in the numbers of Rivertree, for example, there, increase in the numbers of places at Grange, all of that goes directly to the academy. So that's that recruitment that comes out. So again, nothing we can do there. We've increased the number of specialist placements as per the graph. That is a good financial decision to make. It's good for young people as well, get them the specialist education without having to go into a high cost independent. But those are fixed rates. Similarly, where we have place funding in our maintained special schools, so in Ridgeway, where we've increased the numbers of places compared to last year, good news that we've had to do that, but it does mean that there's a fixed cost. We can't do anything about it. We have to pay the place funding that comes out from those points. We also have legacy funding and and CSBG, which used to be a grant that we were given, and then actually it's been rolled into the high needs block, but ring fenced to say you have to pass this out as per. So actually you see all of those ring fence mounts, things that we can't adjust or do anything to, means that already our proposed budget is minus £240,000 on what the forecast budget was in 25-26 by December, before we even start talking about things that we could do variables on. So we have a position where realistically the increase that we were given in budget is in real terms. I think it was something that left about £800,000 to do anything else with, which is obviously it said it means that we had no option but to set a deficit budget, because we also recognise that we had to pass on funding to our schools and our settings. So you'll see we have got increases in the rates of top up. We've budgeted that hopefully we'll use independence and AP slightly less. That is a hope. That's what we've budgeted for. Our commissioned services, a slight reduction in some of our commissioned services, bringing some of those in-house. And then again, internally, some of our staffing, you see a very small increase based on that, but we've made some changes to our internal staffing and funding to try and bring that cost down as much as possible, but leaves us in a position of £4.482 million budget forecast deficit by the end of the year. And this just shows you again where that increases are. So you see the 3% increase and where the growth has been allocated, so where we're anticipating some of the growth to be in the presentation, which has all been shared before this meeting. You'll see this remains relatively consistent, which is positive. We don't have outliers of where the funding is going. It's still relatively consistent with where the forecast was in this current financial year to where the budget is for next financial year. And so that's what led to us having the budget position where we were. So obviously, if we're forecasting for a deficit budget, we also want to have a deficit recovery plan. So you'll see this is again just a summary of why we need it, which is cumulatively we've got 1.5 million by the end of this financial year. Cumulatively, as Rhiannon said, that's over £2 million. Plus, then if we've got 4.5 million, that cumulatively goes to 6.5 million. Whilst recognising 90% of our deficit at the end of this financial year will be paid in a lump sum grant in the autumn term. Again, details fully to be announced coming from government. So our recovery plan, again, we've got a detailed recovery plan that has numbers attached to it that we have to do. We have a multiple page spreadsheet one for the DFE. But for today, it's around actually giving you the high level plan for it. So our principles, the first principle, I just want to be really clear on this, is that no child or young person will have SEND provision reduced if the evidence-based needs exist. The way to recover this is not by spending less on children and young people's provision if that provision is still required. So that is absolutely a priority, that we would not be doing that in any recovery plan. Again, we talk about prioritised capacity for Bedford Borough's own children and young people, which is again where we have schools that are cross borders, and we have a number of our commission services or our internal advisory teams, for example, whereas Bedford Borough's high needs supports those services. We need to make sure that the focus is capacity wise on our Bedford Borough children, but obviously we'll provide support if and when we can, but we've got to prioritise our own, strengthen our ambition, some of the areas, and look at what we're doing is to try and address some of these things that we've got, and invest upstream, reorganise staffing, and it's not a budget in terms of its deficit line. It's not a budget. It's not saying, well, we've got the deficit, we're just going to use that as such. It is a line that is recording what our deficit position is. This is it in pictorial form, which is the biggest bubbles are the biggest anticipated savings. So you'll see right in the heart of that is our drive to open a new SEMH special school. And you'll see the reason for that is we anticipate that if we were to open a new SEMH special school, the annual savings would be north of £1.5 million against the high needs current spend. Similarly, conversation if further education, we have a number of, a growing amount of expenditure in independent further education provision at the moment, as we're not able to meet the needs within the state funded, DFE funded provision. So we need to try and address that. And some of those steps have already taken place. Again, the more special school places that we can create, the less need for high cost independence. So all of those things that we're doing, AP review and TAS pilot around actually how we can support with children, young people who are at risk of exclusion, and try and sort of look at the upstreaming of that support. So all of these things here are part of our plan to try and bring down the overall cost. And for those of you that think that is too much for my brain to work out in bubble format, you may like it in strategic work streams. So you will see these ones around system capacity for inclusive mainstream, redesign selective services, and strategic commissioning for high cost places. And again, part of that is also making sure that we are looking, whereas we might have had some children, for example, who we didn't have local provision to meet their needs at a point in time. In every annual review, it might be that actually we look at things change. Some children, young people at key transition points are able to come back to local state funded provision. And therefore that is a good thing that we should be working towards and looking at our commissioning for. So that's the part of our plan. We have a DSG management reporting that we have to do for governance. We've got a SEND improvement board, SEND operational group, and we are looking at now having high needs operational meetings every 12 weeks, where we'll be seeking representation from this forum and schools, where we will be focusing on that high needs deficit recovery plan and picking up some of the conversations that I think we've had at this forum before as well, such as, think about some of the conversations around the rationale and the reasons for the block transfer that have taken place around trying to support some of those settings who are having the most numbers of EHCPs, disproportionately high numbers of EHCPs. I would anticipate that high needs operation meetings should be where we sort of talk about what other options have we got, how can we avoid block transfers, what else can we do with our funding moving forward, and really have that space where we can start to look at it. And also bearing in mind some of the announcements that are come out today as well. It'll be really interesting conversation about having school representation across that board around the funding that we have got, how to utilise it in the best way to achieve the outcomes set in the white paper, but also more importantly, just achieve positive outcomes for children and young people in Bedford Borough. That is the presentation. I'm really conscious that is a slight whistle stop, and I haven't been able to see any of you because I've been sharing my screen. So I'm going to stop sharing and offer any questions. The point is, by doing that, then the next paper where we effectively set the budget as is per this one makes a lot more sense than doing it the other way around. So hopefully that worked, but happy for any questions.
DJ's got her hand up already. It didn't surprise me.
Okay. Just you alluded, Chris, to the fact that there's a possibility, I think you did, and I know it was reported in the papers last week, that the DFE has agreed to take over the higher need budget deficits of LEAs. Is this the case? I think it's called historical deficits. That's number one. And number two is that if they do that, of course, that would be good and it would change the recovery plan. But what it doesn't change is the amount of funding. And I know you've done excellent work in looking at what we need in Bedford Borough in order to reduce the overall spending in a very sharp, concise way, and one that will meet the needs of the pupils in Bedford in a better way. But is it the case that there will be enough funding given by the government to cover the needs, the special needs in Bedford? And the third question, I might as well throw this in as well. Yes, we've had the white paper out today. There have been certainly trade union reactions to it from head teachers, from the NES and from the NEU, initial reactions to it, which I mean, I have not interrogated it myself, but certainly our union will be interrogating it. Will there be a special schools forum meeting to look at how the white paper might affect the special education needs provision in Bedford? Thank you.
Thanks, Deirdre. I think I captured the three questions, but please do come in if not. Yeah. So yeah, in about 2 weeks ago, 9th of February, so the government announced it's committing to 90% of local authorities' DSG send deficits accrued by the end of the 25-26. So the point is, again, it's historical. And so they have given very limited information. I don't know if more was in today's paper. I haven't had a chance to sort of interrogate it enough to know. But the indication certainly that I've seen was that would be an autumn lump sum payment. But I think it's probably fair to say that they've also indicated that there are caveats to that. So again, for example, I think if local authorities suddenly started lumping on their deficit as if it was like a credit card, I think the DfE have indicated that they are sort of monitoring that. They've appointed, so the DfE have appointed a DfE financial advisor to every single local authority to work with and monitor spend. So again, I think part of that is probably that in terms of keeping an eye on it. So, but it has been confirmed in terms of that it is committed to it, and it's also they did announce, and again, that the statutory override, so the ability for local authorities, you've got to remember, local authorities in theory cannot set deficit budgets. We're not allowed to set deficit budgets apart from in high needs. So the statutory override there is in place, and they confirmed that that will be in place to the end of the 27-28 financial year. And at the end of the 28-29 financial year, they indicated that all funding would become centrally for send. But again, not really clear. I need to look at it today into the details around the funding, what that looks like. Does that mean that all top-up funding, all send funding, all place funding will come centrally? It's still not clear. So there's a lot to be worked through. Is it enough? Was the second question, I think, in terms of the fact that we're setting a deficit budget from the beginning. I'd say probably not. But in terms of in our deficit recovery, do I also think it's right that we're spending 8.8 times the amount of money on independent SEN schools than we don't? No, I don't. So in terms of deficit recovery of trying to build more local options for children and young people within state-funded academies or maintained schools who are able to meet their needs, but special or in resource provisions or not, I think it's still the right thing to do. So I think that's still something that we're still working towards and still working hard. And the white paper, there's so many between now and a white paper announcing readings of it, what then comes through, what then becomes into a bill and what doesn't come into a bill. I think it's really difficult. I think we can absolutely have a continued watching brief on this, and if at any point Schools Forum feel that actually we need to have an extraordinary meeting to talk about this, absolutely more than happy to. But the moment is so early that I don't think we can really answer that, because I think there's going to be lots of changes between now and what actually does come. And I think someone made the point of saying, even if there was no challenges to what is in the white paper, which I think we all probably agree is going to be hard to believe there's not going to be any challenges, but if there's no challenges to it, the time it takes to pass through all the different phases for it to become legislation, we're looking at 2029. So in terms of, it is still a lot to come in that space.
Yeah, and just to supplementary that, I think it is important that we do actually interrogate it, and that we do make challenges if we feel that it actually could be, it isn't as good as it should be for Bedford, and it could actually be detrimental for some schools. And also the fact that, yeah, if they are going to do this historical deficit, I think it's really important, because if you remember way at the beginning of 2025, and when we didn't have a deficit budget, my view on looking at, and certainly our union's view at looking at other local authorities, was that most local authorities, certainly in the high needs block, had to set deficit budgets. There was no question around that, because they wouldn't have survived otherwise. And I think looking at the future and what is coming, I think the Schools Forum needs to keep an eye on that. Even if the deficit, the historical deficit, is 90% cleared, are we being given enough funding with all the savings that you put forward, Chris? Are we giving enough funding in order to avoid a deficit in the future? And I know that question may not be answered now, but it's one that I'd sort of like to put down and make a marker of, and us actually keep coming back at, because I think that is critical to the Schools Forum and critical to the high needs spending in Bedford.
Thanks, Deirdre. Okay, Richard.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks, Chris, for the clarity of that presentation. And I think it's right that we celebrate a lot of those really great statistics on there, the work of schools and of your team across the borough. I think building on Deirdre's point about the white paper, there's some really positive noises in that white paper. And I think lots of us on this call will look forward to hopefully some imaginative thinking about how we can take the opportunities that are hopefully included in that paper, and particularly in terms of providing places moving forward to help solve this situation. I've got two things that I think are worth noting from a Schools Forum point of view. One of the most important things the Schools Forum does is approve a block transfer. That happened this year, and it's a significant block transfer of 1% that places a significant burden on schools' budgets. I will just note that it's good that there's an improved in-year position in the high needs block. I think 1.3 million better than forecast, but I would note that that figure is very close to the figure of that 1% transfer this year. I'd also note that Forum approved, in my view, it was a poor decision, but they approved in the autumn term a further 1% transfer for 26-27, which places a huge strain on schools again. And I'd question whether or not that would have been approved had the announcements that we've just discussed already been made. So my question is, what consideration is there being made to that 1% transfer either being recouped somehow or not taking place, because it is placing a huge strain on our forecast budgets moving forward and the work that we can do to support some of our most vulnerable young people?
Chris.
Thanks, Richard. I had a feeling you might ask that question. So in preparation for today, I asked the DFE themselves what would need to happen if the Schools Forum had a view of reversing the block transfer, put it this way. And I don't know if I'm being cynical or not, but the announcement of when they announced that the deficit would be 90% cleared gave us, I think, the grand total of 5 days to do a whole full consultation back out to schools, call an immediate Schools Forum, get the Schools Forum to then vote on and then approve, because the APS, I got it right earlier. Is it APS?
APT.
APT. Oh, I knew it was wrong. The APT for schools funding had to be set by the 28th of February. So actually, in terms of the DFE's view is, well, you can do that, but the timeline of that was just not realistic for us to do that work in terms of in the timeline from when they announced it for us when to do it, especially when you factor in that we had a February half term in the middle of that. So the ongoing conversation with the DFE, I think, Richard, is to say what options are available to us, because we have to set, in the papers that say we have to set what schools, we have to tell schools for your budget, this is what your budget is going to be. And the fact that Schools Forum had voted for a block transfer, we have adjusted and made those grounds for. So the conversation is still a live one, but the DfE's view is the 28th of deadline of when we've sort of told schools when their budgets are. I'm not sure what can be done to unpick that. But that being said, I'm not a school financial accountant within the DfE, so I can continue to ask the question. But I can say we asked in terms of, but the fact they announced it on 10th of Feb, or whatever it was, and we knew we had the hard deadline of that, there's really not really much time for us to have undone or had a vote on undoing any block transfer on it. Doesn't mean we can't have conversations about what the mitigations could be or what else could be done, but timelines for undoing the block transfer just weren't there.
Thank you. Carol. You're on mute.
Sorry, everybody. Right. In your presentation, you made a lot of the increase in SEMH places that you plan, but the biggest pressure seemed to be on ASD, and there didn't appear to be anything to go towards a local ASD set of increase in placements. I just wonder, why not? Or have I missed something?
Haven't missed anything in terms of our local ASC and our resource provisions. We have two absolutely fantastic ASC resource provisions in two secondary schools, and we have two ASC provisions in our primary schools for that. So we do have those places available. Some of the cost is just in general some of the high cost support packages for children with ASC. Not all of those children are driven by high cost independent or requirements for that, but in SEMH we know absolutely a deep dive into it is absolutely is for it. So again, it's the needs and some of the supporting some of those children with those high cost ASC packages are the high cost packages are enabling them to access mainstream education packages. We're not seeing the same trend in our SEMH, which is why the drive to increase some of our high cost special, our own special school in SEMH for that. That being said, would we like to continue to increase ASC places? Yes, we would do, but within the high needs capital funding that we had to prioritize, and so the SEMH was a more glaring need because we don't have anything in the local area at this moment in time.
Okay. Eleanor. Eleanor, can't see you and you're on mute. Okay, I'll come back to Richard.
So just picking up on the point around the timelines there, I recognise those timelines are tight. However, I also recognise we are all here this evening. It is not yet the 28th. Is there a mechanism by which we could hold an indicative vote this evening on whether or not Forum feels that, given what we know now, as opposed to what we knew when we were asked to vote last time, we would still support a block transfer of 1%? I mean, it may be a futile exercise given the rules, but I still think it seems to be. But it should fall to Schools Forum to express a view on this, given the rules seem to have changed in the interim period, and we're looking at £1.5 million going out of our schools' budgets.
I'll respond now from a finance perspective. The APT is reviewed by the DfE, and the DfE wanted the APT for their review in terms of its regulations by the 13th of February. So that was really the key, in terms of timeline, because in terms of any change on the any change would then require the DfE to review it. and the deadline was the 13th.
Okay, thank you.
But what I can say, sorry to build on that, is in terms of we can continue to ask Richard and have the meeting and see in terms of what else can be done. I think that's not a yeah, I don't want this to be a case of it, you know, and so happy if with the chair, if that is the mandate that is so given, then the challenges in terms of we've got to be really clear on what is the the mandate saying, do people want to vote on not doing a block transfer? That's one thing, but the block transfer is also, we've got to be really clear to and remind ourselves that actually the block transfer was to provide additional funding for those schools with high levels of EHCP. So again, what I think the vote will kind of be either to pop it onto, which is an easy phrase to use for 1.7 million, the deficit. And if so, then it's a case of what is and isn't possible. But that's the kind of the conversation, because I think we can all agree in terms of, I said, as was put forward around the vote yes or vote no for the block transfer kind of point of view was not an easy thing to do. But it was more around, we've got to be clear on what the ask is. But happy to again continue to have those conversations with the DfE to see what is the options available to us.
And we won't be alone. There'll be schools forums across the country faced with this situation where we agreed to a transfer contingent on a set of circumstances that no longer exists.
Yeah.
So it's not particular to Bedford, but it's a particular challenge that I think the DfE are going to have to answer.
I'm aware that there are a number of other people who have indicated they want to speak, and I think we do need to move on. Eleanor Grills.
Well, actually, I was going to two things, but the first one was to agree with Richard entirely. I think we would very much appreciate revisiting, continuing the conversation and asking the question around that, because it's going to have a significant impact on our budget as well, and us providing for the young people, vulnerable people in our school. So, I mean, I would really appreciate that. So I support that continued conversation. The other thing that I was interested in, and sorry, the reason I disappeared is because I'd run out of charge and I had to run off and get my charger. So that's why I disappeared earlier. Is there a little bit more of an update and information about the SEMH provision in terms of where it's got to, timescales, where, who, when, what? I think that would be interesting to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of the current position is still as in the public domain. So we had an offer accepted for the old St. Joseph's lower school building. So offer has been accepted. We are in the position where surveys and everything else are close to completion. We're just waiting on the Section 22 notification from the DfE to give approval to Ollycat as the trust, who are the proprietors of that, to hand that over to us. So that's in the final stages of that. Once that's in place, we will be doing a short public consultation to notify of our intention to then run a free school presumption to seek a multi-academy trust to run a proposed SEMH school in that point. So the timeline is going to be still dependent on us securing and the purchase of that building. But once we do, then we're getting our ducks in a row before that now, so that as soon as we do, we can then announce. We have, again, a amount of funding available to us to purchase and then to do the renovation work. So our intention is to try and secure a provider of the school as soon as possible to then work with us on the designs of that school building, because again, within the confines of what we have, again, don't want as a local authority, we can do as free schools and those who experience those things is, we can design and build and say this is what we're planning on doing, and then find someone to run it. But actually it works a bit better if we can find someone who could be part of the initial design process, so that we can agree, what's the vocational curriculum you want to run, what are your priorities on this, but where do you want to prioritize the initial funding for the first cohort and second cohort, etc., etc., etc.
So I imagine you want to keep that local, because that's sort of part of the principles of this plan, aren't they? In terms of who runs it, yeah.
In terms of I don't think I'm probably allowed to have set reservations on who runs it in terms of on where they are, but in terms of the school being local is part of the plan, yes, in terms of on do it. But there'll be a scoring system around who comes in to puts the bid in, as with any free school presumption bid.
And I hope that the lawyers don't bring in too many delays in that process.
No, so far it's all been good. Just waiting on the DFE now. So in terms of, I'm really hopeful for positive news in the next couple of days.
Okay, right. Thank you. Richard Cook.
Thank you, Chair. Just a quick question, really. Really good presentation, Chris. Enjoyed it, and I thought the focus of trying to focus on the big elements in terms of the independent costs that you've got there seem to be very sensible. It's more a big picture observation that I'm going to make, which is, you've got 10 million there. You're suggesting that you're going to save about 15%, sort of 1.5 million. I'd be sort of encouraging you maybe to be a bit more ambitious on two fronts. It would therefore still be costing 7.5 for the really high needs people versus maintained, but also you're driving in quite a lot of fixed costs in terms of a school for only a 15% saving. And that fixed cost can be difficult to move and manage. You lose the flexibility, and therefore, the suggestion to do it only for 15%. I would encourage you to be more ambitious, Chris.
Firstly, I absolutely love the fact that you enjoyed my PowerPoint presentation, Richard. You are most welcome. Secondly, I agree. I think the challenge we have around where we are predicting this cost, so we can look at where the current costs are. The current costs are children currently in settings. And in terms of moving children who are currently in settings out of those settings to a new setting is a challenge in terms of actually it is something that if those children are settled, if they're in an independent SEN schools and sitting their GCSEs, for example, but costing me a lot of money, I'm not going to move them in the middle of their GCSEs to say I've got a local provision. So it is around those costs actually we anticipate roles, and actually we're talking about cumulatively over a number of years, not only the cost savings, but also the cost avoidance. We are ambitious within that, but obviously you've got to still also be realistic around the rest of those are. But yeah, no, I absolutely appreciate the logic in that, Richard.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, Laura.
Hiya. Yeah, I just wanted I completely understand around the points around the finance position on the EY, but the budgets for the schools. I just wanted to talk from a private, voluntary, independent sector, because they're also they're struggling in terms of the money, in terms of supporting children with one-to-one and their needs that are coming through. And what is happening is the budgets that they haven't got the budget to be able to do that, and in which case it's coming out of their own budgets, their own fees, which they are being forced to put up because of being able to meet the costs of the childcare, which is having a real impact on the private, the PVI settings, in that the fact that they cannot afford to continue. So many PVI settings have closed, not necessarily in Bedford Borough, but the strain in which it's putting on, I think, whilst I understand it's putting pressure on the schools, it's also putting pressure on the early years. And I'm just really mindful that the DFE has said that they are committed to consulting on a wider platform later on in this year around what the early years funding streams look like and whether or not they can simplify those. But I'm really worried that we are going to lose that really early intervention and support and inclusive practice for children in their early stages, where we can make such a difference. And then, Chris, I just had one question around, so you mentioned earlier around children that come from, so obviously in PVI you have quite a few children that will come from different counties into Bedford Borough to access their early education. I just wondered if we knew roughly how much that was, and is it in line with some of the other local authorities in terms of spend?
So in terms of expenditure for children with SEN, will always come from the home local authority, regardless of where the child is. So in terms of be that if a child comes with an EHCP and is then named to go to Sharnbrook School, for example, but they live in Northamptonshire pay the EHCP for that. So in terms of that, funding will always be from the home LA. If it's regards to, sorry, Laura.
I know that there's a couple of children across the PVIs that are getting funding from Bedford Borough but don't live in Bedford Borough? And is that because their GP surgeries are in Bedford Borough?
I'm not sure, Laura. If you could send me their details, I can have a look. But certainly, I think in terms of from a high needs block position, if they're getting funding above and beyond. I mean, if they're getting, I don't know how it works. Sorry, forgive me from a 30-hour sort of point of view and where the funding comes through. But if it's around send funding and from the high needs block, then it should be from their home LA in terms of from where they currently live and reside.
Okay, I'll find out a bit more, but thank you.
Thank you so much. And again, just to that wider conversation, whilst not downplaying the impact on PVIs or certainly within our earlier, I think the wider conversation about the impact on schools was about the dedicated schools block funding transfer. So that is directly, schools funding that was transferred as opposed to the earliest funding, which obviously picked up in a conversation that's going to be later in the papers. But whilst recognising certainly the points made about PVIs and the wider early years system and ecosystem as well as part of a conversation certainly recognised by myself and my early years staff and officers.
Thank you.
Okay, Helen.
Evening. Just a question that may be a stupid one, so apologies. Just thinking about the clawback of deficit from the DFE, looking at Appendix A, you've got transfer of reserves between blocks, and it's about £750,000. Well, it's pretty much £750,000. Just looking on that, that's obviously bringing down the high needs block deficit. Is there an opportunity to not do that transfer and keep those surpluses within the other areas to make sure that the maximum amount of reclaim of that 90% is made? Or am I missing something really obvious?
The DF, shall I pick that one? I think we don't quite know the terms and conditions of the 90%. The DFE tend to look at the deficit at a net position, so they don't look at it on a block by block basis. So
okay, but what I would argue again, just to echo Richard's thoughts, that if you're sitting on a surplus from the schools block and money's been transferred out, surely you would look to reclaim that or hand it back to the schools that have had deductions made. The idea that that's reducing the amount you could claim back from the DFE when a significant amount of money has gone out of schools' budgets seems a bit counterintuitive. I'm just trying to get as much money back into borough council as we could do. Is that something that you would consider? I mean, it's over £500,000 being taken out of the schools block, isn't it?
It's. I think until we know the net position. I think I go back to my earlier response in terms of the net DSG position, so that they don't look at it on a individual block basis. So whether there's a transfer in terms of from one block to another in the year, the DFE will be looking at the bottom line. But we don't know yet for certain what they're going to be looking at for the 90%. To write off the 90%.
I think some of the challenges we've had, again, not from a technical finance point of view, Helen, so I can't answer some of the technical things, but I know when we've talked about reserves and then the pushing the money back out of reserves is going to be around, we have to have a funding formula for how we allocate the funding. So it would be a question of going, so between now and the end of the financial year, so again, the reporting that we have to do to the DFE, who will be looking at all of our blocks and all of our reserves, they amalgamate it all and go, well, this is your end of year position. We would have to find a way of getting that 543 or whatever the block is, what the funding allocation is going to be, how we're going to apply that and get that back out into schools. And it would be a change. So again, I don't know whether it is or isn't possible. It's certainly something we can look into, but I do know certainly when we're trying to we've got money in reserves, there's been a question around, can we get that reserves back out? And the issue is going, we can't just apply it. We have to, we've applied the funding formulas as agreed. That has led to a reserve. We'd have to then create a new funding formula to then get that reserve out, which I think is the complication. But again, not a financial officer, so in terms of, but we can certainly look into it, because again, I agree with you in terms of
It's just an unfortunate position to find yourself in, where, you know, money's being offered and because of decisions made, and I understand why the decisions, I mean, I don't agree with them, but I do understand why they took place. It's just a bit of an unfortunate position, but point taken. And I completely understand that it's a really complicated situation too.
Yeah, and I think that's the frustration again, in terms of, if you think about, you know, it's great to think, you know, we're going to get a potentially £1 million or a bit more £1 million of 90%, but in terms of, you also look at other areas where they're going to get £260 million of, you know, for that 90% deficit, all those bits, and it does seem, you know, inherently just
a touch harsh.
Yeah, in terms of for difficult decisions that have been made in terms of at this forums, and we've come, and, you know, no one is has wanted to do that, and, you know, as Richard sort of pointed out, in terms of we were making decisions based with the cards we were dealt, and then we've now got a whole new deck. It's really challenging. So I think the commitment is to go, really not to just go slopey shoulders, nothing else we can do. It's absolutely about what else can we do, what is available to us, what are our options, whilst also recognising, back to the point of, we're not the only local authority in this position, but also, which is why,
and I would push back hard on that, because at least 2 other local authorities that we take part in made an active decision for a 0% transfer on a wing and a prayer that this perhaps would be the situation. So it feels unduly harsh on schools in Bedfordshire that they're going to suffer because they were trying to do the right thing for the children, but actually haven't played, you know, the right colour chip or whatever it is at that particular moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in terms of, that's the that is the challenge around how do we push back? And we asked the question, as said, in terms of, and we can go back even louder with the fact that we've got Schools Forum asking these questions, and, you know, we can seek more information from the DfE about what our options available to us are.
Okay.
Thank you.
I hope one last question from KW.
Hi, thank you. Just to agree with Helen and Richard that all these decisions that are made have a massive impact on everybody's budgets, and schools' deficits are tricky, and so that deficit goes down the line. So anything that we can do to get money back to schools, however small, we should be pursuing it, because things have changed and nobody wanted to make some of the decisions that we've had to make. We've had to make them because that was the situation that we were in at the time. But if we can get any money back, then we should be pursuing it as much as we possibly can.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And I just sorry, the final point, Chair. I know the next paper hopefully is kind of more of a fair complete, because it's basically what we've just been talking about. But just as a point, I know we all know this, but again, this is not monopoly money as well. It's the only thing, just to make that point of going. So whilst we're saying great, the DfE will get 90% to kind of clear, we still will then have 10% of whatever deficit is left, and that will still, you know, on that, the local authority, it's real money. You've got it in your bank accounts. We've passed it through. So it is a case of it's also making sure that is. When we sometimes talk about this, I know I can be guilty of that, when we talk about deficits of those points, everyone is feeling it. So it is, again, a cumulatively point of, there's no easy answers here, but it is a case of going, even if we have 90% cleared off, that's great. It's still 10% of a deficit the local authority is at some point going to have to pay back. And, you know, that time is coming up in the next couple of years, we think. So it is trying to work through that to just try and say, yes, we want to continue to, you know, pass through as much funding to our schools as possible. Yes, we want to make sure that our SEND funding is fair and equitable, and provide a good system for it. But it is also recognising that at some point, we are still going to have, you know, 10% is still not, it's still better. It's a lot better than 100%, but it is still 10% of funding that we're going to have to find to pay back. So it's a really, really tricky and thorny issue. And again, this is why I welcome a strong schools forum to have these conversations and to work this through, and why I would welcome representations at the High Needs Board operational kind of group to also have a bit more time and a bit more space to think about some of these things around what else can we be doing, how else can we do it, what other innovative, as you know, Richard talked about, you know, thinking about what else we can be doing in terms of in imaginative thinking, in terms of in this approach, and the opportunity it might well give us to do some of that. So yeah.
Okay, thanks very much. And as Chris said, I hope that the next item on the agenda will pass through rather more swiftly, because a lot of the questions have been asked and answered as far as they can be answered. Chris.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So this is the paper that conversely goes with the appendix of the appendix of the presentation that I basically just did. But this is the paper we deferred from the last meeting, which is the noting of the high needs allocation that we've had and how we are setting of the budget to do that. As spoken in the presentation, you will see that the detail is a 3% increase across all lines of funding, as well as anticipated growth in the key areas, as with more detail within both this paper and in the slides that were done. And you'll see it also shows exactly where the place funding is going, and makes reference to the government announcement around from the block transfer as per. So I'll hand back over to you, Chair, for that now.
Okay, so the paper has been done. This is looking at the details. Deirdre, sorry.
Even Deirdre. I think really we can agree to a certain extent in principle, but I think there are a number of questions that have been posed here tonight that needs us to come back and look at it, because there are real issues here about that 1% block transfer and what the government announcement may or may not mean. So it may be a principal agreement, but I do think it has to be. We do have to return to this and see, because there are real issues for schools. The other thing I was going to say, which I think is relevant to the conversation, is the white paper looks as it stands at the moment, doesn't look really brilliant in terms of schools. Now, if you have the block transfer of 1% going forward, and schools aren't going to get enough money to do A, B, C, and D, again, that's more reason to come back to the Schools Forum to revisit this when you have a clearer idea of what that means and what the issues are around that 1% block transfer going forward.
Thanks, Deirdre.
Yeah.
I was going to say in terms of so without not going sort of technical, but the report is to note, not for an agreement or approval of. So in terms of to note it for, and the conversation around what's interlinked, but the conversation around noting the block transfer as well was also within the schools paper in the previous one. Now, again, not to kind of correct this is the challenge around in terms of as a local authority sets its high needs budget, and in terms of Schools Forum notes the high needs budget whilst recognising it's absolutely integral to the conversation of it. So just for clarity on that, sorry, Chair.
Well, thank you, Chris, for that clarity. But as well as noting it, I think we actually need to note that we need to revisit it. Okay.
I don't think we can actually make a decision saying we have to revisit it, because the end of the borough's financial year and the government's financial year is fast approaching, and whether it is practical to do it is a difficult question, or would be practical.
I just put in the chat, Chair, in terms of, I mean, I'm absolutely for something important, I'm more than happy for it to be a regular update and having updates on this position as something that the Schools Forum has in terms of that's absolutely key on that. So again, my point was not to try and say we can't do it. It's more to say I don't think we can do it through that forum, but we can have as many updates on the high needs position and some of the changes and challenges around on it, especially with the conversation today about can we go back to the DFE and ask about the undoing the school block transfer thing. We absolutely need to have an update on that at the next meeting as well. So I think it can definitely be a standing agenda item on where we are with the high needs position, especially if we're going to talk about moving to a no block transfer position, which I think is the intention of what everyone is asking for now. We absolutely need to be really clear on how we are going to achieve the goals of the block transfer in other ways.
Richard Spencer.
Thanks, Chair. I mean, it seems to me timelines require us to approve this, but it doesn't prevent us from registering as a Schools Forum our displeasure and our disapproval of the fact that we're being placed in this position as a result of an iniquitous timeline around announcements. So I think we can, whilst we probably do have to approve a budget because time's running out, there should be, I would suggest and propose, a formal recognition from this forum that we approve it with, with significant reservations and with great regret that we're being placed in this position as a result of untimely announcements. Would that be a sensible? I mean, I noticed we've got councillors on observing this meeting. I think the CYP needs to be aware that we feel we've been placed in an invidious position as a result of DFE announcements and timelines. So if we do it, it's seemingly with reluctance.
In any decision, there are winners and losers, and wearing one of my school hats, I'm aware of the significance of that transfer and for top-up funding, which was the reason, because that would have a very, very negative effect on some schools to try and undo it, or could do. As far as timing of announcements is concerned, that has been a perennial problem of governments wanting us to respond in about 48 hours, not giving us time to consider things.
Chair, I've been on forums for a lot of years now, and I've never been in this position before.
No.
This is unique. And so I think, it's whether or not we wish to arrive at a collective, point or position on this, or some sort of statement that can be framed around the position we feel we've been put in.
Chris.
Yeah, I mean, just to say, in terms of, I think we've spoken at November Schools Forum, we spoke at all schools forums pretty much all of last year around the position of the DFE's late announcements of all of the fundings. That has come in terms of, again, so back to your point, Richard, I say never been in this position, neither has Bedford Borough Schools Forum, both last year or this year, in terms of actually having a high needs budget announcement on the 19th of December is absolutely scandalous. And then have an announcement about deficit payback on the 9th of February when you need to send it off on the 13th of February is also, I think, but just not to hammer the technicality point of view, and we can absolutely put that in writing and have that particular point. The technical point is this report and this budget is to note. It isn't for Schools Forum to approve the budget. It isn't, in terms of a disagreement. The budget is now the budget that is going forward. But we can, and again, the high needs budget and the block transfer, to get a kind of technical bit of view, the block transfer is going directly to where we are putting the funding to, but it is that point. I just want to make sure that, because I don't want people to be sitting here and going, am I voting to approve? People aren't voting to approve the budget, they're just voting to say, do you note the budget as per, which again, I really don't want to get into the technicalities of it, but I feel like I'm being forced into those bits. That's just for clarity, because I didn't want people to feel like their vote is they're voting to approve the budget. They're not, they're voting to note the budget.
In other words, if necessary, hold your nose and vote. So we are invited to consider this report under agenda item 8 and to note the increase in the high needs block allocation, ongoing challenges around the level of funding compared to cost of meeting need, resulting in an overspend in 26-27, as detailed in paragraphs 5.1 to 5.7. To note the proposal to increase the top-up rates by 3%, as detailed in agenda item 6 and in tables 1 and 2 of this report, and to note the recent send deficit government announcement as detailed in paragraphs 5.12 and 5.13 of this report. So those please in favour? Those who wish to not take note? And any abstentions? Okay, thank you very much. We now move on to the early years funding. Who is going to present that one? Going to be Chris, Doris, who?
It's Rhiannon. Rhiannon's on mute.
So that's me, Chair. So,
Yeah.
So the report sets out the funding allocated to the council from central government, showing that for under 2s and 2-year-olds, the funding streams year on year have increased by 4.4 to 4.5%, with a larger increase of 8.4% around 3 and 4-year-olds funding. A consultation was conducted with all early years providers from the 23rd of January to the 6th of February on the proposals in this report, and a copy of that consultation is included in the reports pack. So of the responses received, 100% supported the base rates proposed, and the base rates show an uplift in all funding streams ranging from 3.8% for 2-year-olds to 9% for the under 2s, with 3 and 4-year-olds being uplifted by 8.9%. It's a requirement to have a deprivation supplement for 3 and 4-year-olds, and as such these are also shown in the report and were supported by all respondents to the consultation. In 25-26, in the current financial year, a SEN inclusion fund was established, being funded jointly with 70% coming from early years block and 30% from the high needs block. Given that this is forecasting to underspend in 25-26, the total fund is being reduced from 1.1 million to 802,000, which is still considered to be the right value for that block given the underspend this year. And again, that was supported by the responses to the consultation. So the government have also indicated that they've increased the minimum pass-through rate for 26-27 from 96% of funding to 97%. All funding streams have exceeded this pass-through rate, with a minimum pass-through rate being 98.5% for any particular funding stream. There's also then a centrally retained budget for early years, which the council uses to provide advice, support and the early years SEND team, which is around £1 million, with the increase to 26-27 is to support the increased costs of speech and language support. And as I said, all the consultation responses can be seen in the appendix to the report. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there any questions on this report? Yes, Julie.
I did raise some questions to Doris and Emma Callow earlier, whether they'll be responded separately. I'd be interested. I just had some questions and queries around the underspend in the early years SEND budget, because as Laura alluded to on the ground, that the cost of supporting children with those additional needs is much higher than what is actually being allocated.
Okay, so with regard to the current underspend, it's firstly probably good to note that of all the blocks, the early years is probably the most difficult to predict the spending of and the take-up of the places. Each year there is either an underspend or an overspend, which is rolled forward in the reserve. So the first call on that reserve has to be to fund the overspend that was rolled forward from last year. In terms of allocating that money across to two settings, again, we've got the approved budget for this year and the pass-through rates that are happening. To reallocate it again falls into the same position that we've got with the schools, of we would have to have a recognised and an approved way of passing that through.
So will that be explored?
Okay, I think Chris has got a
yeah,
point
okay,
on that.
Chris.
So I think it says this relates to the underspend against the early years SEND funding and SEND inclusion funding. And I think if you remember when the paper came forward around the adjustment to our processes around the early years SEND, you could see that actually I think less than 5 years ago, overall early years SEND funding was about £350,000, and it was then exponentially growing. And when we unpicked that, we found that actually the rates of numbers of children receiving an EHCP in the early years wasn't keeping up with it. It was just the exceptional funding. Interestingly, when we analysed the current spend against that, and we see the total numbers of pupils that are being supported, it is not disproportionately different. But the interesting thing is actually we're seeing more children receiving the EHCP, so the high needs funding that is then kind of kicking in, because again, when a child has an early years SENIF funding, so SEND inclusion funding support, is before they have an EHCP, and then the idea is around actually to support them whilst they're then securing an EHCP. So again, some of that underspend, and the total funding was made up of both early years block and high needs. So when we have the underspend, actually we look at the underspend against the high needs, and that's where that money is going back into. So again, it's constantly having been reviewed and looked into, but again, it can't just be looked at from a point of view of going, well, look at our early years SEND funding in isolation, because actually a number of those children, quite rightly now, and the right thing, are then now securing EHCPs, and it's the high needs that then funds them through the top up as opposed to the earlier SENF. So again, yes, it will be looked at and reviewed, but again, looking, as Rhiannon said, from the numbers, it's still significantly higher than where it was. And also when we apply it to look at where some of the funding that's coming in for those EHCPs now, it actually brings it back to relatively in line with what we were budgeting for. It's just different pots and different funding sources.
Thank you. Laura.
I think the complicating factor in early years is around the funding, and the SENIF funding and inclusion funding is all based around the funded hours. And because they're doing extended hours in PVIs, that's where it becomes difficult. And I think that's where people are asking for top-ups and saying that they're not getting the money in because it covers the funded hours rather than their extended hours. That makes sense. I don't know if you have the same, Julie, if you have wraparound, but
yeah,
that's the difficulty that PVIs are finding.
It's the support that has to go into place with those children before they get to the point of the ECNAF and the EHCP that is costing the huge amount of money to settings and maintain nursery schools, and the rates that are being paid is just not meeting the amount of intervention that needs to be put into place. I understand that we're all working really hard to get those EHCPs in place so that that funding comes from that different stream, but it's actually getting to that point and the delay in the funding coming through to meet the level of support that we are putting in place at the very beginning when the children start with us. So I think it's the delay for us, but I do understand your scenario, Laura, with the extended hours.
I think one of the challenges around wraparound and extended hours is an interesting one from a PVI point of view, and is similar to conversations with our school settings, for example, around the top-up funding and the funding that goes into support children with the EHCPs is on the core funding hours in terms of at those particular points, which is an ongoing challenge around those with extended days or not. So I think certainly we can. But we can absolutely pick that up and again have a conversation at our earliest reference group and think about and see what the impact and feedback has been on both of those points, both Julie and Laura's point.
Okay. Any other questions?
No, thank you, Chris, for picking that up.
Okay. The recommendation comes in 6 parts. I propose taking the 5 take note sections together, and we are requested to note the universal base rate for 26-27 as set out in paragraph 5.7. Note the discretionary supplements will continue not to be used within the formula as set out in paragraph 5.14. Note the retention of a contingency of £738,890 as set out in 517. Note the contribution of 583,470 to the SEND Inclusion Fund as set out in paragraph 523, and note the responses received regarding the early years funding consultation undertaken with all early years providers attached to Appendix B. Are you happy to take note of all those things? Any against? So the final request to us is to agree the pass-through rate as set out at paragraph 530. Are you happy to agree those? Please indicate. Any dissent? Thank you. Which brings us to the dates of future meetings of the forum. It says clerk. So I don't.
Yeah, I can take that one. So the final item was just to consider dates for future meetings of the forum. So we currently have Monday the 6th of July. That one's going to be held in person in Borough Hall in Committee Room 1. Then we have Monday the 23rd of November and Monday the 14th of December.
We have two close together towards the end of the autumn term. They may not both take place, depending. Chris, you were going to say something.
Well, you sound like you were about to do a very good job of explaining what I was about to say, though, Chair. So in terms of, I was more, and it's kind of picked up on a theme of the conversation today around, and some of the feedback around some of the feeling of forum that we've heard. So again, the putting in of the meeting in December, whilst recognising we may have late notification of allocations again, we might need to do consultations, we might need to have conversations about implications, etc. It just felt prudent. We put in an exceptional December meeting in back in 2024. So again, it felt like actually if we schedule a meeting, it's easier for us to then not have it if we don't need it, but to have it there so that actually if we have lots of funding announcements and different things and late funding and all the sort of things around schools funding formulas to be agreed, we can have the meeting in November. If we don't feel like we're in a position to fully agree or we want more information, we can come back in December or vice versa. So that was the intention. I think that was some of the feedback for it, as well as the desire for some more in-person meetings as well.
And it's easier and more popular to cancel a meeting than to try shoehorn an extra one in. So thank you, everybody. I think I've set a record for these meetings that I chair, not one I wish to emulate, but thank you very much for your attention on what has been a very important meeting. Go enjoy the rest of the evening.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.